On Wednesday evenings, we have been going through the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. And tonight, we're going to check back in with Solomon as he continues to try to figure out how to get the most out of life. Solomon began his quest by only considering options that were under the sun, which means that Solomon was searching for happiness while intentionally leaving God out of the equation. Last week, we saw at the beginning of chapter 2 as Solomon began his experiment. First, he tried being a party animal, but that didn't make him happy. So then he switched it up, and instead he became a workaholic, but that didn't make him happy either. And so after testing out both lifestyles, Solomon concluded that without God, all of it was vanity. That either way, whether he was partying or working, he felt like he was wasting his life. But the more that he thinks about it, the more he starts to wonder, well, even though both lifestyles are ultimately vanity, maybe one has more advantages than the other in the short term. I mean, surely one lifestyle is slightly superior to the other, right? And so Solomon circles back around and reviews his notes and takes a second look at the data. Through a process of trial and error, Solomon had concluded that the party lifestyle can surely not be the right one. That there's no way that that could really make anybody happy. There's no way that could be the right answer. So Solomon then concludes that it must be the productive life. That the productive life of a workaholic has to have more short-term advantage than the wasted life of a party animal. Living a wise and responsible life has got to be a better choice than living a foolish life, right? Let's look together at Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and let's start in verse 12. Solomon says, "Then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness." What does all this mean? Well, Solomon says that although neither lifestyle can give happiness ultimately, Solomon knows that a moral life has to be smarter than living a sinful life, and that working hard has got to be better than just being lazy. So Solomon points out that there are some advantages to living an ethical, responsible, moral, hardworking life. Solomon says that a wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks around in darkness. What he means is that the wise person is at least able to negotiate the paths of life. And when they find those forks in the road that we learned about in the book of Proverbs, that the wise man knows which fork leads to advantage and which fork leads to trouble. But a foolish person is like someone who's walking around blind, constantly bumping into things and getting themselves into trouble. But the more that Solomon thinks about it, the more he comes to believe that without God, neither lifestyle really amounts to anything in the grand scheme of things. Because there is one thing that makes both lifestyles pointless without God. Look at me at the second half of verse 14. Solomon says, "Yet I myself perceived that the same event happens to them all." What is this same event that Solomon says happens both to the party animal and to the workaholic? Well, it's death. So you're probably starting to wonder if you should have come tonight, because you're probably starting to see that tonight's going to be a very uplifting and inspirational message, right? So what Solomon's pointing out is that the wise person is self-controlled and productive, which has some benefits. But those benefits are temporary. Those benefits are only for this life. Those benefits stop at the door of death. Chuck Swindoll said it this way. He said, "One person burns the midnight oil, develops great plans, skips needed vacations, worries about competitors, and then, when we least expect it, they die. The other person sleeps in, wastes their time, gets in trouble, but then both of them end up in the same place, the grave." Imagine if there were two people that were running in a race together. One of the runners was a slacker, and the other runner was a serious athlete. And so the serious athlete is sprinting at full speed. I mean, arms pumping, lungs burning. The slacker is just casually strolling along. In fact, the slacker every once in a while just lays down on the ground and takes a little cat nap. And so the serious athlete very quickly is way ahead, and it looks clear that he's going to win the race by a landslide. But what neither one of the runners notice is that up ahead, around the corner, there's a bridge that's out. And so the serious athlete is running so fast that when they turn that corner, they can't stop themselves in time, and they go right off the edge into the canyon. The slacker, who's just strolling along, is messing around on a cell phone and doesn't notice that the bridge is out and falls into that same canyon. And so both of them end up in the ditch, and neither one of them wins the race. Even though the serious athlete was sprinting and the slacker was walking, they both ended up in the same ditch in the end. And Solomon says that's what living life under the sun is like. That if there is no God, then life is like a race where the bridge is out ahead. It looks like you're winning, but in the end, no one wins. In the short term, hard work seems to make a difference, but if there's no God, then it makes no difference at all in the long term. Imagine that there were two people who were getting a job interview. And part of the job interview process was to take a test on a computer. And so they go to the interview place, and they have some computers set up there. And one of the people taking the interview is a slacker, and the other one is an overachiever. So they both sit down at their own computer, and these computers are set up where they do not save your progress, because so many people use these computers, and you have to input very personal information. And so the computers don't save progress. You're just supposed to finish the test, and then the interviewer will see how you do in the end. So they get started. And the slacker is just kicking back, doing a whole bunch of nothing, texting on his phone, staring around, chewing some gum, not paying attention. The overachiever is typing away furiously. They answer every question in full paragraph form. They have perfect grammar and exceptional spelling. They answer every question in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Latin, just for kicks. And so it looks like the overachiever is winning, that they're clearly going to get the job and all their hard work is going to pay off. But then there's an unexpected power outage, and all of their work is lost. Solomon says that's what life is like, that no matter how furiously we work, in the end, the plug gets pulled on all of us. Imagine that there were 2 baseball teams playing in a baseball game. One team is undisciplined and lazy. The other team is like a finely oiled machine. And so it's obvious very quickly that the second team has worked so hard in the offseason and is in incredible shape. And as the game goes along, the disciplined team jumps out to a quick lead and is just crushing the other team, and seems like nothing is going to stop them from winning by a landslide. But then, all of a sudden, unexpectedly, a meteor comes out of the sky and hits the baseball stadium and leaves nothing but a giant crater in the ground. And so, neither team wins, even though the disciplined team was ahead for a while. And that is exactly what is bothering King Solomon in this passage. The fact that death is the terrible equalizer, that death zeroes out all scoreboards, and that death wipes all slates clean. So Solomon starts wondering, why even try? And sadly, he's right. From a purely human perspective, from an under-the-sun perspective, there is no reason to try. If life under the sun is all that there is, then ultimately there's no difference between the slacker and the workaholic. If there is no God, then nothing we do matters at all, and all of it is vanity in the end. In fact, look what Solomon says in verse 15. He says, "So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity, for there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As the fool." Solomon has come to a terrifying conclusion, that no matter how different the wise man and the fool are in this life, both come to the same end. That living a responsible life doesn't change that fact. That living a moral life doesn't change that fact. No amount of hard work can change that fact. No amount of exercise, diets, healthy living, vitamins, supplements, health insurance, or doctors can change the fact that we all die. And if there is no God, then death is a terrible dilemma that will drive you insane. From Solomon's perspective, his under the sun perspective, life is like a game of Monopoly. When you're playing a game of Monopoly, you might have a lot of fun during the game. You might pile up a mountain of cash during the game. You might accumulate all sorts of property during the game. But at the end of the game, it all goes back in the box. And that's what life is like. We may have had a lot of fun. We may have piled up mountains of cash. We may have accumulated a lot of property. But in the end, we all end up in a box. Mark Twain said this, "When we die, the world mourns us for an hour and then forgets us forever." Ouch. Wow. Mark Twain kind of sounds a little bit like Solomon, doesn't he? In fact, Mark Twain was not a Christian and was pretty against Christianity, and yet I am pretty sure that he plagiarized Solomon as he was saying these words. But this is the same point Solomon's making, that if under the sun is all there is, then nothing we do will last. We're kind of like a kid who's building sandcastles at the beach. And he spends all day working hard. And oh boy, he's building that sandcastle. But then, at the end of the day, it's time to leave. And guess what happens to that sandcastle? The tide comes in, and the waves wash it away. And all his hard work is nothing. Well, that's what it's sort of like living life under the sun. That we spend our whole life working hard to build things, and yet time comes like the tide and washes them away. Now, even the most elaborate sandcastles won't last. For example, I think I have a picture of an elaborate sandcastle up here. That's a pretty elaborate sandcastle, right? So somebody worked really hard on that sandcastle. But you know what? No matter how hard they worked on it, it's not there anymore. You can't go visit the sandcastle. You know why? Because it's gone. It didn't last. Most people are living for soap bubbles in life. Soap bubbles are shiny and they have sort of cool colors on them, but they have no substance and they don't last. They quickly pop. One by one, throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon is popping all the soap bubbles of his life. And once he's run out and has no soap bubbles left, he falls into a terrible depression. In fact, look what he says in verse 17. Solomon says, "Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all is vanity and grasping for the wind." Solomon said that he had come to hate life. Have you ever felt that way? You don't have to raise your hand. You don't have to answer out loud. But have you ever gotten to the point where you hated life? A lot of people have, because that is the inevitable result of a life where we leave God out. Solomon realized that all of his work was vanity if under the sun is all there is. And so it's kind of like Solomon was having a midlife crisis. Now, don't raise your hand, but have you ever had a midlife crisis, all right? A midlife crisis is where you realize that you're running out of time and you start panicking and wondering, what have I done with my life? But for Solomon, it was even worse, because it wasn't just a midlife crisis, it was a whole life crisis. He realized that no matter how much time he had, and no matter how efficient and productive he was in that time, that if this is all there is, then none of it even matters. Now, you might be thinking, well, okay, Brian, so, I realize I can't take any of it with me, but we can leave it behind for our kids, right? I mean, can't we work hard to leave a legacy behind for the next generation? Well, maybe. But what Solomon realized is that no matter how hard we work building things up, that we're going to have to leave it all to someone else. And we don't know if that someone else is going to be wise with it or they're going to squander it, if they're going to waste everything that we worked so hard to build up. And all of us are in this same predicament. We have to leave everything behind. It's like Pastor Roger often says, that you never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul. Now, the Egyptians tried it, right? They buried the treasures with the pharaohs in the pyramids. But guess what? If you go to those tombs, all that stuff is still there. You know why? Because they can't take it with them. All that we own will one day belong to someone else. Every dollar we've ever earned will be given to someone else. And we will have no control over what happens to it then. Here's what Tommy Nelson says in his usual comical way. Tommy Nelson says, someone will end up with your car and spill coffee all over the upholstery. Someone will take your beautiful house, paint it orange, and rent it out to a bunch of college freshmen. The land that is so precious to you will end up as a liquor store in 50 years. Your clothes will end up at the Salvation Army. You can't take any of it with you. All life leads to a casket. Well, thanks a lot, Tommy. That's real encouraging, isn't it? But that's the same point that Solomon's making. Now, you've probably seen these too, but sometimes I've seen bumper stickers that say, he who dies with the most toys wins. Have you guys ever seen that bumper sticker, right? Well, Solomon says that's wrong. He who dies with the most toys just leaves the most stuff for other people to get rid of. He who dies with the most toys just leaves the most stuff for their kids to have to drop off at Goodwill once they're gone. Now, do you know how long it takes the average person to spend an inheritance that they've received from their parents? Aha, you guys know, I had to look it up this week. It takes the average person less than 1 year to spend an inheritance. Now, don't raise your hand, but just ask yourself, if you received an inheritance, how long did it take you to spend it? I'm guessing for the majority of us in here, it probably took less than a year, right? And as I was studying this week, I found out something really surprising in addition, and that's this, that most inheritances leave the people who receive the inheritance either financially neutral as compared to before or worse off. The majority of people end up worse off after they've received an inheritance than before they had the inheritance. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes people think, I don't have to worry about money anymore, so I can be undisciplined and throw the budget out the window, but an inheritance only lasts so long. Another reason that it goes so fast is because sometimes, let's just theoretically say you get a $30,000 inheritance. Well, there was a $60,000 thing you've been wanting for a long time, and so you take that $30,000, you go $30,000 more in debt to pay for that $60,000 thing, and now you are more in debt than before you got the inheritance, right? And so we think, I'm going to work so hard my whole life, and it's just going to be a blessing to my kids and my grandkids for ages to come. No, it won't. They're going to buy a motorhome, and they're going to go on 3 vacations, and it's going to be gone in 1 year, okay? Now, Solomon's fear that whoever came after him would waste everything he worked so hard for, it actually came true. His fears came true. His son, Rehoboam, who became king after him, did lose everything that Solomon had worked so hard for. Rehoboam made some foolish decisions in his reign, and in just 1 year, remember that people lose their inheritance in 1 year? In just 1 year of ruling, his foolishness was so bad that it resulted in a division in his nation that ripped his nation into two, and they became two nations. And Rehoboam ignited a chain of events that led to his nation being invaded by Egypt. And when Egypt invaded, they plundered the temple, which, remember, was his dad's crowning achievement. Of all his works, there was no greater work than Solomon's temple. And yet, when the Egyptians invaded, they robbed the temple till there was nothing left. In fact, look with me at 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 25. It happened in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, that's Solomon's son, that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord, that's the temple that Solomon built, and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away all the gold shields which Solomon had made. Solomon's fears had come true. The people who followed after him lost everything that he worked so hard for. His kingdom was torn in two, and his precious temple was now empty. In fact, there's a sad phrase in this passage. It says the Egyptians took away everything. They took it all. And that is a sad ending to all of Solomon's hard work. But you know what? That's all of our endings as well. They are going to take everything. There is nothing that we can take with us of the things of this world like that. So, Solomon was facing some hard realities. And let's look at the last passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, starting in verse 22. Solomon says, "This also is vanity and a great evil. For what has the man for all his labor and for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful and his work is burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity." If there is no God, what do we really have to show for all of our hard work in life? Just a bunch of exhausting labor, long days, and sleepless nights. Solomon points out how sad it is that sometimes we work so hard to build something up in our life, but all that thing ends up doing is robbing us of a bunch of good nights of sleep, right? If you've ever built up something in your life, you know what I'm talking about. It can be hard to sleep once you've built something up. Because what do? You spend all night tossing and turning, worrying about the future of the thing that you worked so hard to build up. Well, Solomon tells us the future of the things that we worked so hard to build up. They're going to be given to someone else, and there's a great chance that somebody's going to waste it at some point. There's an old movie called Citizen Kane, and it's considered by many film critics to be perhaps the greatest movie that's ever been made. And Citizen Kane was about a man named, guess what? Cain, who was obsessed with money and power. And there's a lot of symbolism and metaphor in the movie. One of the symbols in the movie is Cain's ridiculously large fireplace. In fact, I think I have a picture. There it is. So if you can see, there's Cain standing in front of his ginormous fireplace, right? And this fireplace is metaphorical in the movie. It's a symbol. It's a symbol of his unending, obsessive quest to gain more and more power and to build and to acquire. Now, the next part that I'm going to tell you is a spoiler alert, but the movie has been out for 80 years, so you've had your chance. If you haven't watched it yet, too bad. Here we go. So at the end of Citizen Kane dies, like Solomon says, everybody does, right? So he dies, and what happens to his stuff? The movie ends with his stuff being thrown into a furnace and being burned up and ending up nothing but a whole bunch of smoke. And that is exactly Solomon's point in Ecclesiastes. That if this life is all there is, then everything we've worked so hard to build and accumulate will one day go up in smoke. Now, this part of the chapter, has given us another way to understand the phrase under the sun. There is a spatial meaning to the phrase under the sun, but now we see there's also a chronological meaning. What in the world am I talking about? Okay, so far in the book of Ecclesiastes, we've seen that to live for under the sun means to live for only the things of this world. But in today's passage, we find a second meaning, that living for under the sun means only living for the things of this life. And Solomon points out that it is vanity to only live for the things of this world, and it is vanity to only live for the things in this life. Because here's the problem with living for things in this life. This life will end, because unless Jesus comes back, all of us are going to die. And so the more that we live for this life, the more we're living for things that don't last. And the more we're going to be let down in life. And if this life is all there is, then we could easily end up like Solomon, hating life. But the good news tonight, after all this depressing stuff, is that we don't have to end up that way. We don't have to end up like Solomon. God has given us the book of Ecclesiastes not to make us depressed, but to show us that as believers, we don't have to hate life, and we don't have to give in to despair. Why not? Well, because us believers know that this world is not the only world, and this life is not all that there is. And so we don't have to view the world through the depressing, under-the-sun perspective that Solomon has been testing out so far in the book of Ecclesiastes. And next week, you guys have been waiting so patiently, and I'm shocked that you came back in some ways, but next week, we're finally going to get to one of the sort of more positive passages in the book of Ecclesiastes. Up until now, Solomon has been building up anticipation. He has been popping all of those soap bubbles that people try to cling to in life, and he has been pinning us down with the brutal facts of reality of life under the sun. And if these facts have been depressing over these last couple of weeks, don't worry, you're supposed to be depressed at this point in the book, right? He's tearing us down before he builds us back up here, okay? But next week, we're going to see some positivity. Throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon is sort of like a submarine that keeps going down and then comes up and goes down and comes up. Throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon probably spends most of the time with the submarine down under the water, considering life under the sun, or in this metaphor, under the surface. But then, every once in a while in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon comes up to the surface so that he can get a better viewpoint from above. And next week is one of those passages when Solomon is going to put up the periscope so that he can get an above the surface view of what's really going on. And we're going to see next week that once Solomon brings God back into the equation, then all of a sudden it becomes possible to enjoy life. And not just to enjoy it, but to enjoy it to the fullest. But it all begins with a change of perspective. It all begins with looking at life through the eyes of faith. It all begins with believing in Jesus. And not just that, okay, yeah, sure, there was some guy named Jesus, but that he really was the Son of God, and that he really does love us, and that he really did die for our sins, and that it's true that he came back from the dead on the third day. Look with me at Acts chapter 4, verse 12. Nor is there salvation in any other, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. Solomon has spent a lot of time talking about under the sun, or as it's described here, under heaven. And a lot of life under the sun looks depressing when you leave God out of it. But here we're reminded that there's a way to be saved under the sun. There's a way to be saved under heaven. And the only way to be saved is through Jesus Christ. And if we will just turn from our sin and believe in Jesus, then we can be saved. Not just from our sin, but also saved from the empty life of living without God. You don't have to hate life. You can have joy and peace and purpose and satisfaction in life. It's possible to have those things, but only if you have Jesus. And so I want to beg you, if you don't have Jesus in your heart, if you've never received him into your life, if you've never believed in him and surrendered to him, then please, please, please make tonight the night that you hand yourself over to Jesus. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, Lord, I thank you for the book of Ecclesiastes. So often in life, we're living in a dream world, and we are spending our whole life on soap bubbles and sandcastles. But God, I thank you that Ecclesiastes shows us the futility of all of those worthless things so that we don't waste our life on them. And God, I thank you that Ecclesiastes shows us, as we're going to see next week, that it is possible to enjoy life and to have a fulfilling life, but only when we have you. And so, God, I pray for all of us that tonight we will make sure that we really do have you. And Lord, for those of us who have believed in you, please, God, help us to start setting our minds on the things that are above and not the things that are below. And help us to start living for the next life and not only for this one. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.